Hello, my friends. Welcome to Recent Reads. If you're new here, a new friend, a special welcome to you. I'm Lindy. I read a lot, and so I mostly talk about books on this channel, but I also talk a little bit about some other things. So usually I do a weekly Friday reads, and I didn't upload one yesterday because I was under the weather. I had a flu shot in one arm and COVID shot in the other arm on Thursday. Gorgeous walk to the pharmacy over the gorge to get there. But by the next day I was really feeling the effects. Ache all over, really bad headache, and so I'm going to talk about books today instead. And a few other things. So yesterday, instead of filming anything, I did some mending. I have my favorite merino wool socks have been mended many times. And I had to do another patching on the heel of one of them. They're ready to go again. Listening to an audiobook while I did that. Mary Oliver's collection of essays, Upstream, which I will talk about in my next video. Oh yeah, we went to a concert on Wednesday. A musical performance that was a tribute to Joni Mitchell. So the music of Joni Mitchell, it was at this sweet theater, Belfry Theater, which was like formerly a church. And that venue is right across the street from a knitting supply shop, Naughty by Nature, which has these great rainbow steps going up to it. So I had to have a quick look in there. And there was a tree right outside the theater with all these wishes hanging on it. It's so cool. I love this city. Victoria is just great. So before I get to the 7 books I've finished in the past week, I want to talk about the Giller Prize. As you might know, I have been a member of a shadow Giller jury for a few years. What we do is read the short list and come up with the book that we think should win before the official announcement. So on Sunday, we posted our consensus, which was the book All the Color in the World by C.S. Richardson. Now, as jury member Penny pointed out in the Twitter post, the jury was not unanimous. I was the one who wasn't unanimous because my favorite is Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. But All the Color in the World was my second choice. So this is what happens with juries. You have to compromise, and All the Color in the World is a wonderful book. I do recommend it. But on Monday this week, the official announcement, Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein, won the Giller Prize. So congratulations to Sarah Bernstein and to all of the authors shortlisted and longlisted for the Giller. Well done. Now, there is something that happened at the ceremony, the Giller ceremony on Monday night. Lori and I were watching it live, and just before Suzette Meyer opened the envelope to announce the winner, there was a commotion. So protesters jumped on stage, and although we could hear some yelling, the cameras, the CBC camera had shifted right away I think they were focused on the band instead, and they were drumming, trying to drown out the sound of the protesters, I guess. But I did hear the word genocide and thought it probably had something to do with the crisis in Israel and Palestine. Laurie immediately went to Google to search for news about what actually was going on. And we learned that the protesters were carrying signs that said, Scotiabank funds genocide. So I needed to find out more information. I learned that Scotiabank funds a company called Elbit, which is an Israeli arms company, to the tune of $500 million in shares. They're the largest foreign investor in this arms company. And that really gave me pause for thought. Ethical investing is really important to me. I have a pension, and I want my pension funds to be invested in things that are good for the world, not in arms and weapons, not in oil and gas development and that sort of thing. So that happened. And I just would like to say that I am 100% opposed to genocide in any form. I am also opposed to anti-Semitism, anti-Palestine sentiment. I'm opposed to Islamophobia, attempts at genocide directed at whomever are abhorrent to me. What has been happening in Palestine, the Jewish Holocaust during the Second World War, the Shoah, what's happening with the Uyghur people in China, and what's been happening with Indigenous peoples in my own country, Canada. So wrong. What I can tell you that I am for, what side am I on? I am on the side of peace. And I would like to read a poem that the gay Rabbi Irwin wrote in response to the crisis in Israel and Palestine. Today I am taking sides. I am taking the side of peace. Peace, which I will not abandon, even when its voice is drowned out by hurt and hatred, bitterness of loss, cries of right and wrong. I'm taking the side of peace, whose name has barely been spoken in this winnerless war. I will hold peace in my arms and share my body's breath, lest peace be added to the body count. I will call for de-escalation, even when I want nothing more than to get even. I will do it in the service of peace. I will make a clearing in the overgrown thicket of cause and effect, so peace can breathe for a minute and reach for the sky. I will do what I must to save the life of peace. I will breathe through tears. I will swallow pride. I will bite my tongue. I will offer love without testing for deservingness. So don't ask me to wave a flag today unless it is the flag of peace. Don't ask me to sing an anthem unless it is a song of peace. Don't ask me to take sides unless it is the side of peace. With that, on to the books. And this first one, I was going to keep till the last because I always save the best for last in my videos. This is my favorite, but it relates so much to that poem that I was just talking about and the whole issue of strife against our fellow human beings. The book is Begin Again by Oliver Jeffers. Oliver Jeffers is an illustrator and author from Northern Ireland, who mostly writes children's books and all ages books. This one is most definitely an all ages book. The subtitle is How We Got Here and Where We Might Go, Our Human Story So Far. It is in bright, shocking pink, purples. It's very philosophical. I'm just going to read one section. So where are we all going again? Well, we don't know where, but it's a race now to get there. Feet running, one in front of the other, towards easier, faster, newer, cheaper. And as we race, we use these same hands that built space rockets to hold each other back and pull each other down, choosing time and again that it's more important to be right over wrong than to be better over worse. The difference between right and better is that being right is about proving the past, while being better is about building the future. We should know by now that while it's wise to keep an eye on the past, for we often repeat our mistakes, if we keep both eyes on the past, we are blind, for we are not going that way. So, where are we going? Such a great book. And next I have another picture book to tell you about, and this one is most definitely a picture book for adults. It's in the adult section at the Victoria Public Library. It's called The Mysteries, and it's by Bill Watterson and John Kascht. So the same Bill Watterson who wrote the Calvin and Hobbs series. Yes. So the two artists, they're both artists, worked together on the illustrations, and there's something quite surreal and special about them. You can see it's not in a graphic novel style, it's in picture book style with text on one side and pictures on the other. And it's about humans and hubris and questioning the unknown. Another philosophical visual narrative that I highly recommend. 5 stars. And next I want to tell you about an audiobook, a memoir called Unearthing, the story of tangled love and family secrets. It's by Kyo Maclear. She is of mixed ethnicity. Her mother is Japanese. Her father was British. Her parents met in Tokyo, which is where Kyo was born, and then they moved to England and then to Canada, which is where she grew up. In this memoir, she talks a lot about her mother, a very unusual woman, not like other Japanese women. She was an artist. She was uninhibited, non-compliant, non-conformist, inconsistent. A good example, at the cemetery where they were receiving her father's ashes, she overheard her mother telling somebody who was serving her coffee, "I lost everything this week. I lost my husband and I lost my Air Miles card." And another thing about her mother is she was friends with Yoko Ono. Now, Maclear never uses Yoko Ono's name in this memoir. She just uses the letter Y to refer to her, and first letters to refer to a lot of other people as well. But it's pretty easy to figure out who she's talking about. So, for example, when Kyo was 10 years old, they were in a shop and her mother heard music being played. Kyo said that it sounded like screaming and somebody saying in Japanese, more, more, more. And it turned out that it was an album that Yoko Ono had recorded, simulating orgasm. And this is what Maclear has to say. I was only 10. My breasts were 2 tiny hills, and the Japanese artist's confidence, the possibility of becoming an unbridled adult, seemed remote. I was so shy. I could barely confide my desires and wants to myself for many years. But somewhere I tucked away the sonic promise of her moaning, socialized by her orgasmic screaming, mothered by her music and outspokenness. I learned the possibility of unapologetic desire, the power of becoming an unbecoming woman, a woman demanding more. There are so many connections in this audiobook to other things that I've been reading, as well as what's going on in the world, like the crisis in Israel and Palestine. So in reference to that, Maclear married a Jewish man. She says he had a muddled and erratic relationship to his Jewish identity. He's a secular Jew who remains attached to the philosophical groundwork and cantoral traditions of his ancient religion, but who rejects the ideological springs of Zionism and is horrified by the violent unhousing and displacement of Palestinians in his name. There's also connections to a book that I talked about last week, Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker, because Maclear wants to find out more about her genetic heritage on her father's side. She heard from an uncle that her paternal grandmother had mental illness, and because her father was fostered from a young age, she didn't have a lot of information about her father's side of the family, just that little small bit. But her father suffered from mental illness, and she worried about herself and her sons and if there might be epigenetic concerns. So she decided to send off a DNA test. Well, what she discovered was that she has no biological connection to the man that was her father. So she had to turn to her mother for answers about that. And her mother was very slippery with information. And this is typical of her relationship, the mother-daughter relationship. And she talks about assimilation also, which I immediately connected to things that Chief Robert Joseph said in his book, Namoyut, that I talked about last week or 2 weeks ago. Maclear says, assimilation is tricky. One must be different enough to be likable and interesting, but not so different as to be threatening or to invite harassment. One can be anti-assimilationist at home and festively cultural, while encouraged to be politically and publicly integrated so as to reduce social friction. And then she also talks about the Japanese concept of ma, which I could immediately see resonated with a book, a novel that I talked about last week, Denison Avenue by Christina Wong. So the concept of ma, it's a word for a pause or an interval or even emptiness. She writes, there's no direct translation, but the kanji characters that form the word show a sun peeking out in the space between 2 gates. According to Hayao Miyazaki, American movies, with their frantic pace and obsession with plot, are often afraid of that silence, that ma. Yet Life is filled with empty spaces and details that aren't directly useful to the story, but have their own emotional brio. That is what Miyazaki is always telling us with the lulls and quiet moments in his films. Two characters riding a train in stillness, silently watching a landscape at sunset, or observing the slow performance of a spinning leaf, remind us that dialogue is not the only way that people talk. And this idea comes up often in that book, Denison Avenue, that I mentioned. The theme of gardening comes up throughout this book, Unearthing, which, by the way, the memoir is read by the author in the audiobook. But that is one thing that Maclear and her mother share, is a love of gardening. Each chapter is very short and vignette-like, and I thought this memoir was beautiful, and I'm very pleased that it won a Governor General's Award for nonfiction. Next up is another audiobook, very different. This one is young adult fiction, Those Pink Mountain Nights by Jen Ferguson. Jen Ferguson is Métis from Alberta. I talked about her book, The Summer of Bitter and Sweet, last year, I think. An award-winning book. She included queer characters in that novel and in this novel as well. Queer characters are right at the center. We have 3 different teenagers who are the main character, and the point of view switches between them, plus occasionally some other points of view and some news reports and that sort of thing. It is set in Canmore, Alberta, and these 3 teenagers that I mentioned, Cameron, Jesse, and Berlin, all work at a pizza place called Pink Mountain Pizza. Social issues and concerns are central to the plot. Cameron's cousin, another teenager, has been missing for several months, and she's Indigenous. It seemed like the police didn't try very hard to find her, and there's other things going on as well. I really appreciate that the plot and the development of the characters don't take second billing to these larger social issues. Each one is very real and very true to the way that teenagers talk. We're in close third person for most of these, but you know, they say things like, "She did me a solid." Berlin didn't fault people, she faulted the system, and maybe those people who refused to see that they were ensconced in a system. Berlin is a fiery character, jumps on activist causes maybe with more enthusiasm than forethought, but that's what teenagers are like. And Jessie has her own special way of communicating. Like, she talks about the unhoused and other folk down on their unlucky charms. And it was snowing, big drama-rama flakes. One of their friends calls Berlin a tofurkey. Yeah. If you're into contemporary realism, if you're looking for Indigenous literature, I highly recommend this. And it is on the list of a new resource. It's part of the We Need Diverse Books initiative, and it's called Indigenous Reads Rising. I will include a link in the description box below. It's a celebration of Indigenous children's literature of Native nations, centering those within United States and Canada. They've got it divided up into 3 sections: young adult, chapter books, middle grade, and picture books. So if you want to know what's recommended for Indigenous reading, I highly recommend this new website. And the next book I have to tell you about is also by an Indigenous author, a lesbian Mohawk writer named Beth Brant. Brant was born in Detroit, and her connection through her father is to the Tyendinaga Mohawk Reserve in Canada. And this book, A Generous Spirit, selected work by Beth Brant, is a collection of her writings. Beth Brant died in 2015, and this edition was edited by Janice Gold, who's from the Conco Nation in California, I think. And Gold died in 2019. There's a foreword by Lee Maracle, who's Stolo from Canada. Lee Maracle died in 2021. And there's an afterword by Deborah Miranda, also Indigenous. There's about 20 different pieces in this collected works, and I recognized many of them because I have been reading her work for decades. So the majority of them come from the book Mohawk Trail, which was first published in 1985. And my favorite from that book is Coyote Learns a New Trick. It's fabulous. And that collection, Mohawk Trail, has a combination of personal essay, short fiction, and poetry. And then she also put out a collection of short fiction called Food and Spirits, came out in 1991. And the title story from that book is in here, also fabulous. And then towards the end, there's some works from her essay, Writing as Witness, and there's some printed versions of talks that she gave. Of this selected work, A Generous Spirit, this just came out in 2019, and my Lesbian Plus book club is going to be discussing it at the end of this month. As you can see, there's lots of things to talk about. I want to give you a little bit of a feel for the style of her writing. She really captures a colloquial voice. So many of her stories are in the voice of someone, either like herself or not necessarily, but so real, very real. This is a piece called Mohawk Trail that seems largely autobiographical. My dad worked in a factory, making cars he never drove. Mama encouraged Dad to go to school. Grandma prayed he would go to school. Between the two forces, Daddy decided to make cars in the morning and go to college at night. Mama took care of children for money. Daddy went to school for years. He eventually became a quiet teacher. He loved his work. His ambition, his dream, was to teach on a reservation. There were so many debts from school. We wore hand-me-downs most of our young lives. Daddy had one suit to teach in. When he wore his beaded necklace, some of the students laughed. His retirement came earlier than expected. The white boys in his Indian history class beat him up as they chanted, "Injun Joe, Injun Joe." My mama stopped taking care of children. Now she takes care of Daddy and passes on the family lore to me. Beth Brant had so much influence on other Indigenous writers and on specifically other queer Indigenous writers. She edited a collection called A Gathering of Spirit, and that came out in 1983 from Firebrand Books and the Women's Press. And in it, she included 11 Native lesbian writers, counting herself in there. So Beth Brandt didn't have anything published, or she didn't really start writing until she was 40 years old. Yeah, and yet she has had so much influence on Indigenous and queer Indigenous writers since then. Next, I'll just talk briefly about this craft book, Farm and Folk Quilt Alchemy. It's subtitled A High Country Guide to Natural Dyeing and Making Heirloom Quilts from Scratch, and it's by Sarah Larson Buscaglia. I will link information about her enterprise down below. She lives in Colorado, dyes her own natural fabrics, and then makes quilts out of them. And I found this really inspiring in the sense that I've been working on making quilts from my naturally dyed fabrics myself, and this is giving me more impetus. The first part of it is about natural dyeing techniques, and then the second half of it is quilting techniques. So if you don't have a book about either of those topics, I think you have everything you need in this one book. I don't feel like I need to own this one because I already have a lot of the information that's included in here, but I did learn things, some special techniques, especially about working with dyes that are in the wood chip form, and the techniques that she uses to make sure that her dyed fabric is absolutely color fast before making it into a quilt. Very important, because you don't want the colors bleeding onto each other after you go through all that work. Here's an example of just some of the projects that she has in here. Gorgeous work. Last up is a graphic novel adaptation of Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, the first book of the Neapolitan quartet. The text was adapted by Chiara Lagani, and the illustrations are by Mari Cherry. Translated by Anne Goldstein, who has, I think, translated all of Ferrante's work. This book came to my attention because of Shaun the Book Maniac. He has been doing a series on his channel called Zooming In, and knowing that I am interested in graphic novel adaptations, he sent me a link to an article about them, and the interview was actually with Mary Cherry talking about this adaptation. So that conversation that I had with Shaun about that particular article should be coming up soon on his channel. I'm going to include a link down below to that whole series, which is fantastic. And I am so glad that it brought this book to my attention. I loved the Neapolitan Quartet, and revisiting it in this new format just brings back all of the pleasure of the original, the evocation of mid-20th century Naples is here. Of course, we don't have all of the text, but the important plot points are there, and even more important is the feeling. This is a very impressionistic style, and it captures what is so fascinating about the relationship between the two friends in this series. Lenu, who's telling the story, and her friend Lila. So friends from childhood onward, but maybe more like frenemies. They compete with each other. They are sometimes mean or malicious towards each other, and yet they're also there for support. And it's these inner feelings that are portrayed so well with the illustrations in this graphic novel. The menace of Leinu's overbearing mother and Lila's violent father, and those two brothers, I think they're the Chiruli brothers, who want Lila. All of that, all of those emotions are there in this graphic novel, and I loved it. I think it's great. And that is all I've got for you today. So thank you so very much for watching. Thanks for sticking with me and waiting an extra day to hear about what I've got to say about books. I appreciate hearing from you in the comments down below, so please do say hello. Tell me if you've read any of these books, and love to hear from you. You all take care. Love you lots. Bye for now.